come on back. Also, feel free to, like, if you haven't already, you need to get up and do a stretch. We can do that in the next hour and a half for sure. We'll take a stretch break. Okay. Had some really interesting conversations during the break too. So hopefully we'll have some time at the end. Feel free to bring up any of your thoughts, learnings. So now we're going to deeply dive into how immigration issues intersect with the work that we do in the child welfare system. How do we do this work? It's interesting because we don't have great data. There's not good data nationally for a variety of reasons, and kind of by design. We don't know exactly how many immigrants are involved in the child welfare system across the U.S. There are estimates from a national survey but the last one was completed 15 years ago now or something. So we don't have any really recent estimates, but from the first two national surveys completed, we saw that children of immigrants are actually a little bit underrepresented in the child welfare system, and that can be for a variety of reasons, whether immigrants truly have areas of resilience that make them less likely than the general population to be at risk for child abuse and neglect in their households, or whether it could be what we call a surveillance issue, whether immigrants are kind of more underground, less involved with some of the community and social services that might actually be seeing any concerns that exist. We don't really know. But what we do know is that children become more vulnerable when parents stop seeking benefits, when parents stop reporting crimes that they might be seeing, and when parents don't bring kids to school or appointments, which, that has been documented to occur after any kind of large immigration worksite raid, which hasn't happened in a couple of years now, but can happen at any time, and for any variety of reasons. Oftentimes when there's some sort of enforcement operation, people go into hiding, and they stop going to school, they stop seeking health services, etc. And also now with this entirely huge, hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied minors who have now been placed with sponsors throughout the U.S., who we also don't know, the number of placements that have disrupted and what's actually happening to all of those children of youth. But what we do know is that they have not been given the sufficient supports, tools, stipends, cash assistance to actually support having a new child in their home. So, cases of abuse and neglect that involve parents and children who are immigrants are much more complicated, typically, than your average very complicated child abuse and neglect case. And immigrants have been found through several different sources to be less likely to receive the services they need that will help them to get out of the situation that they may be in, involved with the child welfare system. So I like to start in framing this. There's a legal analysis of real case law throughout the U.S. of a colleague of mine from the American Bar Association Center on Children in the Law. She did a legal analysis a few years ago that provides a useful guide for how we should be working with immigrants who become involved with the child welfare system. And so basically what happened is she reviewed a bunch of different cases and case law from throughout the U.S. and how they ended up, what ended up happening legally in those cases. And it provides now principles for how we should be addressing every legal case that involves an immigrant parent. These principles are basically that all parents have a constitutional right concerning the care, custody, and control of their children regardless of their immigration status. So we have to be providing equitable services to immigrant parents regardless of their legal situation, regardless of where they're located, even if they're in another country. The second principle is that agencies are required to satisfy reasonable efforts in cases involving detained or deported parents. It can be really hard to do, but we'll talk about some ways to do that. Agencies should also be looking into reunification with a parent in their home country, and agencies cannot terminate parental rights based on standards of living in another country alone. That can't be a basis for terminating parental rights. How do we know this? Through case law, where an agency terminated parental rights based on the standards of living in another country, and it was overturned in appeals court, for example. It's not reason enough to terminate someone's parental rights. Another principle is that parental deportation does not constitute abandonment without additional evidence of abuse or neglect. So just because a parent has been detained by Immigration and Customs Enforcement, just because they've been deported, doesn't mean that we can say now that they've abandoned their child. That is not reason alone to have an abandonment plea, essentially. So all parents, and the last one is that all parents have a right to participate in the hearings and have legal counsel represent them. And the complications in facilitating cases where a parent has been detained or deported do not nullify a parent's right to participate in proceedings. So like basically we have to find a way to engage parents and provide them all the same services as we provide other parents, regardless of the immigration context. So how do we do this? And in conjunction with these principles, there's some actual very real challenges that have been documented repeatedly over the past 15 years in serving immigrants who become involved with child welfare. So let's see if any of these are familiar to you. Our child welfare agencies often experience challenges coordinating with Immigration and Customs Enforcement in situations where parents are detained. They have trouble finding immigrant detainees who might be detained and sent anywhere around the country in some cases. We also have difficulty assessing the immigration status of children, really even figuring out like what is the status, like what of children and families, what do we even how do we work with this? And then difficulty connecting them to legal resources. In more recent years, this also includes assessing the legal situations of children who have previously been considered unaccompanied and in the care of ORR. We find that there's difficulty identifying viable relatives for placement, especially if other relatives are undocumented themselves and fear being connected with a government agency like a child welfare agency. And then some agencies and states are not able to license undocumented relatives as foster care placements. So I wanted to ask the state, county people in the room, what is your policy? I couldn't find anything online. What is your policy on licensing undocumented relatives for placement? Are you able to do that?
I don't think so.
No?
You have to be documented.
You have to be documented to be eligible for placement. Okay. So it's a really good...
For licensing purposes.
For licensing purposes. Are you able to place children with undocumented relatives and then keep them You can place with undocumented relatives?
Like kin, they would need to be licensed.
The same as kin? They would have to... But you... Wait, so I'm confused. So you can place or you cannot place with undocumented relatives?
You can, they just can't be licensed.
She said if it was like kin.
Oh, they're like kin. They can't be licensed. You don't have to license them, though. So if they're not licensed, do they receive a subsidy?
No.
Okay. So I'm going to send you all or point to a resource, too, that the American Bar Association did a while ago. looking at the different states and how they do this. So there's a variety of ways. Some states are able, they actually license relatives the same as you can license anyone else, and license kin so that they are actually able to get subsidy as well. There are several other states that I think do what I think I'm hearing you all do, which is you can place with undocumented relatives but not license them, so they don't actually get the supports. And then there are some states that also say nope, like you can't place children with undocumented relatives no matter what, under kind of the argument that they are too. That the placement would be too unstable in the case that an undocumented relative could be deported or something like that. Go ahead.
I just want to
Question?
clarify. So if they're a relative by law, which is like an aunt, I don't think like a great aunt qualifies. They can receive kinship, and they don't need to get licensed. But say it's like a neighbor that they consider an aunt, they would have to get licensed to receive placement within 30 days.
Okay.
So if it is a relative,
Mm-hmm.
they can receive kinship. You don't need to be licensed for kinship.
Oh, I see. Okay, got it. Here you don't need to be licensed for kinship. Okay. Got it. But you do need to be, but with kinship you get a subsidy?
You get a payment.
You do get a payment. Okay. Okay. All right. That makes sense. Go ahead.
I feel like I'm like not the right person to answer this question, to like say this, like someone else in this room should know, but it's an issue that we can place people with families, but then there's an issue of permanency where like you might be able to place a kid somewhere, but that doesn't mean we're ever gonna close a case and allow that kid to stay there. You know, like what is the most permanent outcome for the kiddo? And so we don't want to place a kid somewhere that they're gonna stay for a while and then ultimately have to leave.
Okay. So you can't let kids stay.
I don't know, that's what I'm like kind of asking.
Any other thoughts or questions with undocumented kid relatives? Go ahead.
I was able to, as an ongoing worker, place a child with an undocumented immigrant relative who's his older brother, and then that older brother was able to adopt. But it did take a lot of coordination between corporate counsel and the state and really advocating. So I don't know if that's common practice for each county.
Or if you have policy on it, basically, that walks you through how to do it. Yeah, okay. That's good to know. So it has been done, but we don't really know if it's common practice. Good to know. Go ahead.
I think another issue is like between states. And personally is like we had a situation with our family members that are undocumented that were supposedly going to get placement of a child or two children. Everything was going to go fine. Social workers stopped contacting them, out of state social worker. And then the time period went by where it's like the 30 days to 60 days. And then that child was adopted out and nobody has been able to like contact this child because of that. And then they are saying that it's because it's legal over there with their own welfare, CPS, whatever it is. And then here it doesn't make sense. So it's like there's just no communication within different states, which one is going to like perceive the other one, you know, like
Yeah.
just very difficult. And the same thing
Yep.
is because of the person is undocumented, so then they have to go through extra hoops, and then the time frames start
Yeah.
going away, and then the children just go.
Yeah, so for like interstate compact, ICPC kind of cases, right? Like if the kids are in your state, but then in another, there might be an undocumented relative in another state. We've had that happen too, right? Where then the other state kind of discovers that there might be some legal immigration issues, and then they fail to, because of their own kind of process or policies or not, they stop actually kind of vetting that relative, or they stop responding or whatever it is, because they say, well, we can't actually license that person, or we can't do anything with that person. So cross-state issues that's an issue too. Good point.
There's
Hey.
a lot of parallels here between the Indian Child Welfare Act and
There is a lot of parallels between ICWA, Indian Child Welfare, and immigration issues. In fact, it's like one of the arguments that we've made in New Mexico for, we have a whole tribal affairs and like ICWA unit, why we needed a parallel immigration unit. Isn't it interesting? Yeah, so this is really helpful to get context from you all about like what you think, how it might work here. Other issues include parents or relatives in other countries. It can be really hard to find them and do the necessary home studies, get children placed with them. It's also really hard for parents to participate in cases that cross international borders if they're deported or just living in another country. Lots of agencies have trouble creating meaningful connections between the children and youth and the parents while the parents are detained and deported. It can be really hard to facilitate visits between kids and parents. Parents might also face a lot of barriers in actually meeting these timelines. Someone's talking about the timelines and the time that's passed for these requirements due to the lack of required services or a lack of eligibility for services or like a lack of services existing where these parents are residing. And if someone is detained and deported, it's also a lot more challenging to participate in family court proceedings too, in the court proceedings. And I think as we've all mentioned, as our child welfare cases have our own timelines for hearings that don't match up at all with immigration timelines, especially if a parent is detained in that system. And so everything that's required of parents in a court-mandated treatment plan before the child welfare agency will terminate parental rights normally has to happen within 15 months. And for parents in immigration detention for indeterminate periods of time, or those who are in detention and then are deported and have to don't have a home and have to kind of figure out what they're doing, these can be very, very challenging to meet these timelines. This is one of the slides that got really screwed up when I switched from a Mac to a PC, so I apologize, but in the context of these challenges, and I'll just try to talk about it a little bit, there's actually 3 key federal policies that offer pretty much the very minimum of what our child welfare practice with immigrants should entail. And the first is around consular notification, which comes from the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, is an international convention. Under this policy, a foreign country's consulate must be notified when a minor is in the custody of the state without delay. Different states have different interpretations of this. In New Mexico, for example, we consider a child or youth to be a foreign national if one of their parents was born in another country. So we notify a consulate even if the child's a U.S. citizen, but their parent is not a U.S. citizen, because it implicates the entire case. Typically, unless it's a country where it would not be in the best interest of the child or the parent to report that they are part of a child welfare case. If a country is not part of the Vienna Convention, basically. The second policy is special immigrant juvenile status, which actually comes from the Immigration and Naturalization Act, like the major immigration law in this country, which basically stipulates that if a child's eligible for special immigrant juvenile status, if they're an undocumented child, the state or the county should be responsible for making sure a petition for that gets filed. We'll talk more about that. And then the third is related to reporting suspected trafficking to the Office of on Trafficking in Persons. And this comes from the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which you can kind of barely see here, which states that federal, state, and local officials who have information about non-citizen minors who may have been trafficked, we don't have to know for sure, but they might have been trafficked, they must be referred to this Office on Trafficking in Persons. So I'll tell you a little about that. Okay, so first, basically, for consular notification, the state child welfare agency has the duty to notify a foreign country consulate when it takes custody of a non-citizen minor. Again, some states interpret a non-citizen minor to mean someone who would qualify for citizenship in another country if one of their parents is the non-citizen. And the child welfare agency should notify the foreign the child's foreign national consulate without delay, and there's this one exception when it would somehow create a risk to child safety. And so different jurisdictions, states, and counties have different interpretations about that, and the question is like, really, why? So oftentimes, if you have relationships with your foreign consulates, they can actually be a really helpful resource in locating documentation, passports, IDs, birth certificates. They can help find family members. They can help get home studies done in other countries. They can interview the parents and children. In New Mexico, for example, we work very closely with our Mexican consulate, which essentially oftentimes comes to some of our like very big family-centered meetings to help the parents to kind of bridge any kind of like cultural concerns, fears, divides. They're actually able to help advise parents on, how the process works, how they would advise they should be working cases, etc. So some questions for y'all you can or you don't have to answer now is like whether you know what's the process for counselor notification in your county if a child comes into care, and do you do a counselor notification yourself? Who provides the counselor notification? Do you have formal relationships with consulates, and how do those work? Does anybody have any thoughts, ideas, feedback, questions to share? At this point? No? Oh, okay. Also, just on our website, we have an entire page of state-based resources that have a ton of different policies on consular notification and formal agreements with foreign consulates, and how it works in different states. Like if you need a guide for how it works in Wisconsin, because that again was something I could not find publicly available. All right. Okay, now for special immigrant juvenile status, for an undocumented foreign national child to be eligible for this status, this is a humanitarian visa that can actually then eventually get a child legal permanent residency and a path to citizenship. So it's really, really important. It is really up to the child welfare agency to ensure that if a child comes into care, it's for children who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned by a parent. And children are eligible for this status if reunification with one or both parents is not a viable option. So if the plan is reunification and you're going to reunify with both parents, they're not eligible for this status. But if the plan is to only reunify with one parent, or you're not going to reunify with either parent, a child is still eligible for this status. And you have to be able to obtain a court order. It also says that it's not in the child's best interest to return to his or her country of nationality or last habitual residence. And also have to say, what also needs to happen is the child has to stay under the jurisdiction of the court throughout the application process for special immigrant juvenile status itself. So the child has to be in the U.S., under the age of 21 under federal law, and not married. So that's an important piece. If for some reason the child is married, legally married, or if they're an older youth and are married, they're not eligible for this status. Different jurisdictions around the country do this very differently. What I would say, ideally, there's all sorts of complications around this status, and the regulations are changing all the time. And so, especially in recent years, what we recommend is that all children should have a legal screening, a legal immigration screening with an immigration attorney, and then an attorney should actually be applying for this and working to get the necessary documentation from the child welfare agency, but they should be represented by an immigration attorney. Go ahead, questions?
If they turn 21 and for whatever as this is processing, are they not eligible?
No.
They have to be under 21 at the time of.
You have to be under 21 at the time of application, and so there are plenty of children and youth who turn 21 as they're waiting. You just have to get the application in before they're 21. And it actually, it also depends on state law. Again, I don't know if and how state law works. Like in New Mexico, until recently, our law was that you had to apply before they were 18. But then we recently changed it to match so that you could apply up until 21 through like extended foster care. Was there another question?
I was just going to say, in Wisconsin, it is 18. So you have to have the family guardianship or petition completed before the child is 18.
Oh, good to know.
But in Illinois, it recently changed it to 21. So
Great. Thank you. Thank you for providing these beads of wisdom. It's very helpful. So in Wisconsin, it is 18, so you have to apply before the child or youth turns 18. Even though the feds will accept to 21, but go ahead.
okay, the family petition part of it has to be completed before the child turns 18. But the immigration part
Can go.
can go after that.
Got it. So the family petition, like the predicate order, is that what you're talking about? So basically what happens with this is that you need to get again, not a lawyer, so maybe talk to this is a great opportunity to connect with lawyers about this, is basically what's needed from the child welfare system or the family court or the children's court is a separate court order that you get from your child welfare judge that essentially just has to stipulate these things. And there's lots of like language and guidelines around it and all sorts of resources and help. But you need to get a separate order, and then you have to send that order in with a packet of a whole bunch of other stuff to immigration officials to do the actual application. And so that's where you want an immigration attorney to help. But so my understanding is you need to actually get that court order from your family court before the kid turns 18, but you can apply until up to 21. You can submit the official immigration application until 21. And then it does get a little more complicated, and what happens in a lot of places is it's great. It offers a path to legal residency, but for several years, there's been like a huge, really long backlog in SIJS applications that delays permanency a really long time for eligible children and youth. And this is because there's a limit in the number of people who can actually get legal permanent residency every year from SIJS, depending on their country of origin. Basically, this is just like a little map. This is called the State Department's Visa Bulletin, and I'm just showing you a snapshot, not that anybody would look at it on a regular basis, but each month the State Department provides a chart like this with visa availability for different visa categories in different countries. And SIJS is included under that fourth category. It's an employment-based preference immigration visa category. And what these dates are under here is it basically tells you like the date of application that they're now processing, like accepting. So if you applied in September, of 2018, that's right now who they're doing doing legal permanent residency for. So it's like 5 years later. So it's like a 5-year wait to get legal permanent residency. But the SIJS category is especially backlog. In the most recent Visa Bulletin also, countries like El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras are newly included in this like all chargeability areas except those listed. They used to be even more backlogged as separate countries, but they've now kind of like been interpreted to fall under that list. So yeah, I mean it's kind of crazy, but there are also newer SIJS regulations that no longer required a child to stay under court jurisdiction until legal permanent residency is actually achieved. So technically, you can apply for SIJS, they could accept the SIJS, and at that point, from a state perspective, I believe, once you have SIJS, you can apply for Medicaid. Children are actually eligible for Medicaid. And so you can actually start to get some benefits for a child. And we no longer as a state system have to keep, or as child welfare systems have to keep that child under the jurisdiction, have to keep them in care. per SIJS regulations. Is there a question or comment?
Yeah, so I just had a question. Can they work during this time legally?
No.
Okay.
Yes. No.
There is an option now to apply for a work permit.
That's what I thought I thought it just changed. That's what I thought I was like, wait a minute, I think that just changed. You can, yes, so now, because it's so backlogged too, there's a whole national coalition that has been really pushing for some of these SIJS changes. So, basically, you can get SIJS. You can get, with that, you can get, you can get Medicaid, and you can also apply for a work permit temporarily. So, but you're not, so you can actually get these things for kids. The things that would actually be most meaningful to them. You can get them a work permit, and you can also, now, you can essentially not have to keep that child or youth in care until they get legal permanent residency. You can move towards more permanent permanency options for that child or youth. However, what this actually means, though, that any permanency plan for children and youth should contain some like really strong guidance for the child and youth and their guardian or parent or adoptive parent, for them to be following up and follow up with an immigration attorney, and to continue to have that relationship, so that when the time comes for them to apply for legal permanent residency and eventually citizenship, that they don't just miss it. Because when it's time to apply, you have to apply. If you never apply, then a child turns 18, they become an adult, and this is what has happened in many circumstances. There's an assumption that because a child, has a guardian or is adopted by a U.S. citizen, that now they're just a citizen, and that's not the case. And in many, many cases, children have ended up turning 18, and all of a sudden they're deportable, because they don't have legal permanent residency. So it's really, really important that they continue to follow the process and that they're connected with an immigration attorney. Okay. So, not going to talk about this for a long time, but just a few minutes discussing human trafficking issues. Immigrant children and youth are uniquely vulnerable for being victims of sex or labor trafficking. Often, youth come to the U.S. with human smugglers who require some debt to be paid for their travel, whether that be sex acts or working somewhere in exchange for travel or shelter or food. I don't know if you've seen the New York Times recently exposed like a whole operation of high rates of labor exploitation of migrant children recently arrived to the U.S. And so, this is just not an uncommon situation. And so here, I'm not going to go through this at this point for time, but we have very specific federal definitions for what qualifies as trafficking. Here are some basic red flags for trafficking. And so I think when you're working a case, it's not really up to us or you to necessarily have to decide, like, has trafficking actually occurred? But, there are some red flags here that, like, if this is happening, it might be something you want to look at or actually get officially screened. If for some reason kids have large quantities of cash, if there's, like, doing some sort of strange job, if parents have for some reason given their children away for money or drugs, if there's any like sex acts involved, if there's any sort of fear or like skittishness about an employer or about anything, if there's tattoos or branding, there's if the answers that children give to you change, or they don't seem to add up about where they've come from and how they got here, and these can all be signs that they're trafficked. And so the most important thing for the Child Welfare Agency to do is not necessarily to substantiate whether or not trafficking really occurred. It has absolutely nothing to do with like a criminal investigation of trafficking. That can be totally separate. But what the Child Welfare Agency must do is report any suspected commercial sex trafficking or labor trafficking within 24 hours to the Office of Trafficking in Persons. And so they must, let me see where it is. We do. Oh, you can see it a lot better on your screen than mine. There's a website for where to do it, essentially. And then what this office does is determine if the minor actually is a victim of trafficking or not. And, it might just seem like another thing to do, but I can tell you we have had some really positive and helpful experiences by doing this for our children and youth. It's really important to do because there might be certain benefits available to the child. And like this whole list of benefits, if a child is issued an eligibility letter or an interim assistance letter by OTIP, they suddenly have a social security number, Medicaid, like all access to all these benefits, and a federal case manager throughout until they turn 18, even if they leave our child welfare system. They continue to have access to these federal benefits. Go ahead.
Can you talk about how OTIP determines, like, does there have to be a disclosure or an investigation? Like, how do you determine?
No. Yeah, how does OTIP determine? So this is really cool. We have found really, really willing to like consult on every single case. And so basically what we do is we go to OTIP and we tell them, here's what we think is happening. And here's why we think it's happening. And the youth has said this or that, and maybe the youth hasn't fully disclosed, but like there's some weird things that don't add up. All you have to do is disclose everything that you know, and OTIP with that makes a decision. Sometimes they come back and they'll be like, well, we need a little more information about this and this and this, and so then we go back to the child or youth and might have to ask them a few questions. But what we've actually found is that they're actually pretty lenient on like what they qualify as suspected trafficking. It's not like there has to be firm evidence. It's really more just suspected. And so we've gotten lots of interim assistance letters issued really quickly when it just seems like there might be some trafficking happening here. And then all of a sudden the child or youth has like all access to all these benefits. And so it's really, really helpful to talk to OTIP and apply for these things like as soon as you think it might be an issue. Typically, we like to do it with our immigration attorney or someone who is really trained in screening for trafficking. But how we know it works with trafficking with kids is kids often almost never disclose trafficking in the first several interviews until, they've built trust with someone over time. But like, if you have a case where you think maybe there's trafficking or not, and then you later get more information that like, oh, actually there might be trafficking here, that you can always go back and, apply or give OTIP more information later, etc. Go ahead.
Is OTIP only for immigrant children?
Yes, it is this program is very specific to non-citizen children and youth, because the benefits it provides is for non-citizen children and youth. Yeah. It's not for all children and youth who are trafficked. Yeah. But good question. Others? Okay. So there's a couple other policies. One, ICE Parental Interest Directive. These are executive, like administrative policies. ICE actually has their own policy that allows parents and guardians to make alternative care arrangements for their kids. So basically, if a parent is detained, this policy stipulates that they should be allowed to be detained in a center that is near where their children are so that there could potentially be visits. And ICE is supposed to facilitate parental participation in child welfare proceedings and services and programs, and they're supposed to facilitate regular visitation. My understanding is that ICE now has like video conferencing in all of their detention centers at least. And it's also possible to get approval to do in-person visits and for parents to be released temporarily to do in-person visits. It's also possible to, if a parent has been deported, to actually be able to help parole them into the U.S. to participate in hearings. although it's usually only for like the TPR hearing if their rights are going to get terminated. In plenty of other cases, though, you were able to get parents in on video conferencing for court proceedings. And so basically here is just, here's just the information for when working with parents in ICE detention. Here's how to find out where they are. We don't always even know if parents are in detention where they are. There's an online ICE detainee locator. You can try to find them that way. And there is actually like, okay, it's only, I think there's a team of like 4 social workers in the country or something, but I think they're getting more. But they're the ICE parental interest coordinators, and they actually are like the social work arm of ICE, and they're awesome, and they answer that email right away. And so anytime you've had a parent who's been in detention, or you're not even sure if they've been in detention or if they're currently in detention, if you're not sure of like what their legal situation is or if they've been deported, you can email that person. And same with kids. If you're not sure of like what their legal situation is, or if maybe they have an ICE hold, like a removal order, like maybe they've been apprehended at the border and you're not really sure, like does ICE know about them? You don't want to be like telling ICE that these kids exist. But what you can do is email this social worker person and ask if they have any records of like the kids or parents. And then they'll tell you what they know. They'll tell you if like what their current legal situation is do they have a deportation order on them, or not, or have they had no contact with ICE, etc. So these people can actually be really helpful when you're trying to put the pieces together about what's the legal situation of the families you're working with. And then there's also the protected areas policy that I hope everyone knows about, but not a lot of people do necessarily. This used to be called sensitive locations, and it basically says that ICE should avoid enforcement at certain protected areas. So basically, like, ICE cannot do their operations and detain people at any of these kinds of areas, and you'll notice that social services establishments are included on that. So like our offices, ICE can't come into. So what actually really helps is to, establish your offices, advertise them as safe spaces, as protected areas, put flyers up like this is a protected area. We have resources on that on our site as well. But if ICE ever tries to enter, unless they have a warrant, a court-ordered warrant, they make up their own warrants sometimes. They have their own administrative warrants. Those don't count. But if they have a court order that says, they have to enter the premises because they believe a very specific person is in there, then you have to let them in. But that is very, very rare. So, but if ICE ever comes to any of your offices, and in most places that you would ever work with clients, you can deny them entry. And it's also, I think, pretty helpful for our clients and our families to know this as well, to know that, we're this kind of government agency, but we're not that kind of government agency, and here's the protections we have for you. And if for some reason there is a violation, or ICE is trying to do something they shouldn't be doing, there is like a civil rights office and there's a place where you can file complaints. So there's information about that. Okay, does anybody need to stretch? Because we're going to talk a couple cases now. We're going to talk at least one case. So please feel free to stand up and stretch if you need to. Yeah, go ahead. Questions?
Are there times where, ICE doesn't want to work with, you said there was, difficulties with ICE and, CPS. Are there times even with, the ICE parental, whatever, that there's, difficulty with getting things to be coordinated?
All right. Okay, it was supposed to be a stretch, but not a talk. Sorry. Sorry. No, because there was good questions. That was a really good question. So the question was, are there times when, the ICE parental interest coordinators wouldn't want to work with us? No. Let me tell you so the actual ICE parental interest coordinator used to be an advocate on the other side and so she kind of infiltrated the system and has created this kind of office, which under the Biden administration, they're expanding it. They're actually really trying to form strong partnerships with child welfare agencies, really to help the kids and the people who have been detained who are parents, to try. They can't really do anything about the detention, but we've actually had cases where, like, we had a mom who got detained when we were working with them, and we were like, oh, shoot, now what do we do? Like, we don't know what's going to happen to this mom, and is she going to be deported? Are we going to be able to, is she going to be able to get back out so we can continue to work with her? And that parental interest coordinator, I think she actually got her out, because she had a deportation order, was scheduled to be deported. She told us, okay, she's scheduled to be deported. Let me see what we can do. Let me see what's happening. And somehow magically that mom was released back out within a week. Was back out. And so I've never had an experience with them where they actually make a case harder. Like, they'll help you as much as they can.
So
Yeah.
do you need a release of information, an ROI, especially when you're communicating about a minor?
We don't typically do that with them, because it's surrounding the care of it's surrounding their care, essentially. We don't interpret it that way. Here's the thing, we do not provide any information about the case. We don't have to give them any information. They might ask some things. We give them no information about the case. The only thing we give them is their, like, names and dates of birth, to see if they're in the system, to see if they have been involved in the immigration system. And then they give us information. So the only thing we're providing is the very basics, so that they can tell us whether they have had involvement in the system. Yeah, that's a good question, though. Any others? Okay, so case scenario. Let's talk about this, and I don't know if any of this rings true, or if other questions come up during, we can talk about this too. But so let's say Ricardo, he's 16, and we had a very similar case to this not that long ago. He's currently in foster care because, oops, there's a typo there, sorry, but because he was found in a local shelter after his mother's sister, who he was living with, kicked him out. And during a visit with his caseworker, he shares that when he first arrived to the U.S., he thinks he was in an ORR shelter, and then was sent to live with his mom's sister, and then he was forced to work on a farm, on a dairy farm. And he was told by her that his family owed money to the person who brought them to the U.S., and that he had to work to help the family pay off this debt. And he hasn't had contact with his aunt since being kicked out of the home, but he has been able to stay in contact with his mother via phone and video calls. She's living in Honduras. She was deported at some point. And both Ricardo and his mom have said they want him to stay in the U.S. so he can complete his education and hopefully get a job. So are there any thoughts what you might do in this case? Any thoughts about what might be going on? Hand raise, and go ahead.
Would you call it owed tip? Because he's forced to, because there's like that part where he has to work, like pay off his debt.
Yep.
And was forced to work on a dairy farm, so maybe that?
Yeah, that sounds like there could be some like labor trafficking exploitation situation kind of there, right? Yeah. Yes, so you would get information about that, screen him for trafficking, and definitely notify OTIP. Yeah. Anything else?
Connect him with an immigration lawyer to see if he's eligible for the juvenile.
Yeah, special immigrant juvenile status. Well, we don't know anything about father, but mom is clearly in another country. Mom is doesn't want him to come home. Technically, mom is the respondent on this case, and so, you would file on like neglect or something, lack of supervision, or depending on how your state statutes work, and you could technically get SIJS for him, probably. I mean, it would be he would probably be eligible. And so, yes, like, find your nearest immigration attorney so that they can screen, possibly for a trafficking visa, possibly for an SIJS. And actually, like, an immigration attorney would know, but they can apply for both. Like, you can apply for multiple things if they qualify, and I'm not going to get into it, but there's different reasons that you might apply for different visas, and that a child or youth might, a youth at this age gets to decide, what visas that they might actually want to apply for. So you would work with an attorney on that. Yeah. Anything else? I can.
Questions?
Yeah.
I'm a bit concerned since I'm not in child welfare, but I was wondering if a juvenile qualifies for any of those visas, who pays for that immigration attorney?
Well, that's a very good question, and that's about collaboration. I mean, this is kind of where we're getting to the culmination message of this presentation I get is, the question is, so if they qualify for these things, who pays for the immigration attorney? And that would be the answer of your county or state. What should be happening is, well, there's a couple things that the state would be paying for an immigration attorney. There are lots of organizations, child welfare agencies around the country, including ours in New Mexico, that has contracts with nonprofit legal services organizations. So, there's some low fee or some no fee immigration services for our kids. And so, but as a child welfare agency, I would argue that, like, one of the responsibilities is to build the right relationships with the right kinds of attorneys and organizations who can make sure that these things are getting done for your kids and be responsible financially for it. Yeah, go ahead.
I was wondering if a juvenile is involved in the juvenile justice system, adjudicated delinquent or anything like that, will they still qualify for that special juvenile?
That's a really good question. Potentially. I didn't get into juvenile justice matters, but in New Mexico, our department also is child welfare and juvenile justice, and so our immigration services cover both. It depends. There are certain disqualifying crimes. And again, I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to name them, but there are certain disqualifying crimes for juvenile offenses, but it's not that many, actually. And so a lot of youth that have juvenile records can still qualify. But again, that's something that, like, you want to, walk through with an immigration attorney, for sure. It also has implications for how youth who are immigrants who have juvenile charges pending, for, how they should plea. And so the youth should also, who are immigrants, if they have a juvenile record, they should also be getting, consultation on the potential immigration consequences for different pleas they might take. Yeah.
Immigration lawyer issue in Dane County, the immigration.
Sure.
It's a problem.
Sure. It typically is a problem everywhere, yeah.
So we are presenting, I see, please help me out here, but there's the Center for Immigration Law that we run at Dane County and Immigration Affairs Office. The Dane County
awesome.
is not able to provide legal immigration law services to
Correct.
There's a division there, but we do work closely with other partners to try and find pro bono immigration law services, low fee, or to create partnerships where we can direct families to get that legal support. But it's often long term, as you described, this can go on for years. So finding an attorney to stay and follow families throughout, there are just very few that are able to do that. So it might be starting out or supporting, but it's something we're working on, but it's definitely an issue.
That's awesome to know. I did hear that Dane County, you have an immigrant services unit or something. Immigration Affairs Office for the whole county, which seems like it would be a great resource.
It's a great great resource. There's the licensed social workers and program leaders, but it's again a part of a partnership because it's not adequate to address
Yeah.
all the immigration needs, and we also part of the Central Hispano and Jewish social services that handles most of the refugee work. So, but it is a good place to start.
That's great.
Particularly for our department staff, some of these visa questions.
That's a great, that's a great place, a great, great resource, a great place to start. I mean, and lots of places have challenges. I mean, everywhere has challenges with having enough immigration attorneys and legal immigration services to meet the need. I think the way we've, approached it in New Mexico, to make sure that our kids, some of the most, vulnerable and at-risk kids who potentially face the most consequences if they're unable to get assistance, the way, and because it's our responsibility as a state agency, the way we've approached it is to to help assist further the capacity of the legal services organization. So, by providing state funds at this point to support those organizations to take cases. And so, but of course, there's lots of other, it's finding funding. It's, finding different funding sources to support the work and creating those formal partnerships. Yeah. Thanks. Okay, so just looking at the time, I'm going to kind of move through some of this to get us to the last case. Basically, we talked about most of this, but the one thing is to notify the Honduran consulate if that's something that hasn't been done, the consular notification. Honduran consulates, on our website, we also have a list of all the consulates of many countries and where they're located. If you don't know, which Honduran consulate applies to your jurisdiction, we can probably help you find that. And in my experience, the country of Honduras sometimes can be helpful, and sometimes you won't get an answer for a long, long time. And so, it can be hit or miss, but we also have a network of folks that can help, gain access to consulates in different places of the country if need be. So we can be a resource for that as well. The other thing is to connect, that we had on here was to connect with Ricardo's mom for info about other potential relatives that might be in the U.S. Are there any other relatives that mom has that may, be good resources for him in the U.S.? And then we would also connect with the ICE Parental Interest Coordinator for info on mom's case, probably. Was mom deported? Does she have, for what reason? Sometimes parents will tell us, I'm trying to get a visa, or I'm trying to get back in the U.S. And you're is that real? Is that likely? Is that going to happen? So sometimes it's helpful to get information from ICE about her case so that we can more accurately determine does she have a pending application that might actually get approved or not. Okay. So the basis for the rest of kind of our what is the take home, our recommendations is really on two recent qualitative studies that we've completed. One, where we've actually documented the models that child welfare agencies have implemented to provide services to child welfare involved children and families with immigration issues. And we interviewed folks from California, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, and Oregon that have probably the most robust systems that we're aware of for serving immigrants involved with the child welfare system, so that we could really understand the models that they use for success. And then we also recently interviewed about 30 agency administrators and frontline staff in several states to understand the experiences serving immigrant children and families during COVID. And we identified several different challenges and new service needs, as well as some really interesting innovations and adaptations that different agencies around the country are using. So, with that, we've discovered, in some of these recent interviews, we've discovered some newer challenges to service provision since COVID, some related to all of the challenges that everyone faced during COVID with court and office closures, family visitation challenges. Lots of people also experienced transnational service barriers. So if parents or relatives were like in other countries, it was like everything got shut down for probably over a year, and that became really challenging. And immigrant families, we heard, were disproportionately impacted, I think, economically, and had a lot of issues with basic needs like food and housing, and economic insecurity, as many were not eligible for like some of the stimulus packages and things that were offered. And so many communities really came together to provide extra supports for immigrants in their communities. We also discovered some serious technological gaps that immigrants specifically face due to lack of internet access, financial constraints. When everything moved to everything, it was really, really hard, especially working with immigrant families due to a lot of lack of access to technology. And so what we heard as well, one of our primary findings was essentially that specialization is key, how that knowledge of immigration issues, how working effectively with immigrants in the child welfare arena really requires us to have some sort of specialized staff position, unit, or expert within the agency to support people on these cases, that you need bilingual and bicultural staff sufficiently to be able to sufficiently support families in these cases, and that there needs to be ongoing training for staff on immigration-related issues and the processes that are used. And then folks also talked about how important it was to actually implement and then adhere to very specific specialized policies, so that kind of everyone's on the same page about how things work and how you're supposed to work with them. We also, another finding from our interviews focuses on the importance of this cross-system collaboration. Everybody we talked to talked about how important it is to meet requirements to comply with these federal statutes like consular notification, obtaining SIJS, especially through establishing some formalized relationships, like whether it's contractual partnerships or memorandums of understanding. It's been really key for people to actually providing seamless services to immigrants. Yep. So this includes with consulates, with immigrant legal service providers, with other social service providers that might specialize in services for immigrants and refugees, and even formal relationships with ICE can be helpful, which sounds kind of strange, but sometimes people struggle, to think why would this be? But it's important to have identified contacts within ICE and to solidify these relationships with ICE in your state in the event that any of the parents you work with end up being detained, so that you can also have somebody to contact quickly and to help engage in visits and court proceedings. ICE officers, relationships are key. If you get to know somebody in an office, they will potentially actually help you and make the process smoother for you. I think that's all I'll say about that. And then also there was overwhelming consensus in our interviews that practices should be formalized and codified in child welfare policy. So we summarized some really specific policies and procedures to implement to support good outcomes. And so again, it's interesting, not sure how many of these policies are codified within your agency, but these are some good ones. I think we had an interesting discussion around undocumented caregivers being eligible to approve, and so like, what's the actual policy on that? Like, is it kin? Is it not kin? Is it? Go ahead.
I looked it up because I
Oh, good.
don't want to give anyone information.
Misinformation. Yeah.
The state statutes say nothing about needing to be documented, but it does list a bunch of barriers, such as if you're going to transport, you need a license. Well, licenses are depending on states. Wisconsin doesn't allow undocumented people to have a driver's license.
That's a barrier. Yeah.
Home owner insurance, health insurance, renter's insurance, all those things that you need to prove documentation on, but they won't necessarily have. Even we know work barriers, needing an SSI number, sometimes they're using, I've seen other people use fake names, fake stuff that doesn't match up, then
Yeah.
not necessarily they need to be documented, but it sounds like there are a lot of
There are a lot of barriers if you're requiring this, if you have the same requirements for licensure of undocumented immigrants as you do for everyone else. Yeah. It's interesting because in New Mexico we created a policy that actually had to stipulate that like that you don't have to have a social security number. You can use a social security number or another form or an ITIN or another number, right? So you can, and also like you don't have to get fingerprinted specifically if you, most still do, but it kind of depends on like where are your fingerprinting machines. Maybe don't put them, don't require people to go to police stations to get fingerprinted. And if people are worried about getting fingerprinted for federal purposes, we have like other checks, other different kinds of checks that we do. Just for undocumented relatives specifically. And it's all kind of like laid out in our procedure. But that's something to think about, in your own policy and procedure as you're thinking about the barriers. Some of these other policies, thinking about like incorporating aspects of like the parental interest directive and the protected areas policy into your own policies and making sure that all staff are aware of them. Thinking about how does confidentiality work in information sharing with immigration authorities? Do you have policies or statements on that like you do not share information about your cases with immigration authorities? We've definitely had immigration or ICE, calling our hotline and calling people before, not in this administration, but in the previous administration, trying to like look for certain family members and look for people who they somehow know have a child welfare case and trying to get us to give information about it. And we have clear policy that we don't share that information. And we're regularly training staff on it because there's a lot of turnover. Different policies on screening and referral for immigration relief and how to obtain SIJS. And then also thinking about like how you do document translation and interpretation. Do you have a language access plan? How do we ensure that like people have access to what they need in their own language readily available, especially even like all of their documents, all of these really important court binding documents, are they all available in a language that individuals understand? And finally, even when policies and procedures are codified, these immigration-related cases still often require creativity and adaptation as new challenges arrive. We heard this overwhelmingly too. So, some examples we heard were child welfare agencies can use technology to increase family engagement, like FaceTime, especially WhatsApp. It's like everybody should have WhatsApp on their phone. Calling, after hours, not trying to stick to our own typical like visitations, what they look like in timelines, but really trying to help families access when it works for them. Maybe and other modifications to programming, and then collaborative to work across borders. And I'll give one example of that. Is that this transnational casework, it can really be facilitated again through either strong relationships with consulates or through a group an organization called International Social Services USA. It's actually a network of professionals in, I want to say, over 80 countries that provide social services in 80 different countries. And you can do like one-off services or form some sort of contractual relationship. They have contracts with the federal government as well to provide services, but like lots of states have contracts with international social services that can go and find people in other countries, and they can do home studies in other countries and welfare checks and all sorts, any of these services really. They can do community resource assessments. So if you have judges or if you have people questioning whether in Romania, in a certain part of Romania, for example, like, do they have the services that these kids really need though? Like this kid has high medical needs, so we can't send them to live with like grandpa in Romania here if we don't know if their needs will be met, and if they, are in this like house with a dirt floor and no water. And so how does this actually work? So people, through this agency, you can do specific community resource assessments, like looking for certain needs, and they'll map out what services are available in the community and like kind of just how it works. And we found it to be really helpful as well. There's post-placement services. So if you place a child in another country with a family member, for example, you can also then like request that they follow up, and they have follow-up social services there. They can help with repatriation, with, traveling with children if need be, et cetera, et cetera. So we have found this organization to be really helpful when typically as a child welfare agency, we'll be like, oh, what do we do? We can't do that. All the things that we do here, we have no idea how to do there. There is an organization who's been doing this for a really long time. So I think I have one more kind of case scenario for y'all to think about, and then if any other questions or thoughts come up, let me know. Okay, here we go. An undocumented father of 2 young children is working a reunification case, so his children are in care, due to issues of neglect. And this actually was a case that was part of the case law analysis that I talked to you all about before. So the issue was lack of supervision, and multiple times the older child was found at home alone caring for the younger child while the father was working, and they were pretty young. And the mother of the children passed away a year ago, and the father works at a restaurant and then is detained on an ICE warrant because he had entered the U.S. illegally. And he had been deported once previously too. And so here the 2 children are in foster care, and the dad's trying to get him back, but then he gets detained by ICE. And the children were at school at the time of the raid. So what do you do? You're working a case with a dad, and then he's detained. So what would you do in that case?
I've tried getting in contact with the father to see what he wants to do. Is his plan to try to come back to the U.S.? Is his plan to be a country of origin?
Yeah, well, at first, let's just say he's detained. Like, he's in ICE detention. So, get in contact with the dad. How do you do that?
Google search, I don't know.
Well, we have that very nice online detainee locator, so where you can find people. And then that's when the parental interest coordinator can be super helpful. Like if you have an open case and a parent is detained, you can call or email those parental interest coordinators right away. Go ahead.
I had a situation similar several years ago before maybe there wasn't even a parent coordinator at that time, I don't know. And I think the father was in Chicago detained. And so I just called the detention center directly, and they let me talk to him.
Yep.
Because we had to make plans.
Yep.
And, he was getting deported.
Mm-hmm.
And so we helped his son meet up with him in the country of origin.
Awesome. That's great. And so she said that she had a case, somebody was in a detention center in Chicago, and she just called the detention center and they let him talk to him. Depending on, if that was during the Obama administration, that would have been the case. If it was during the Trump administration, so basically it means it depends on the detention center, but if you're in Chicago, it's good. If you're in Texas, they might be less likely to let you talk to somebody. It depends on the detention center. And it's also good that you knew what detention center dad was in. So you don't always know where they're going to be placed either, because people get moved sometimes too. So that's why the parental interest directive is helpful, because you can request that somebody stay in close proximity to their children, and then not only are you supposed to be able to talk to dad if he's in detention center, you're supposed to right away be able to set up visits and calls with the kids too, as frequently as they want. So that's helpful. That's really good to know. Yeah.
I would presume, with the children in foster care, there's court proceedings, so ensuring that the father's aware of the court proceedings and able to attend if he wants to. Yep.
Ensure that dad is aware of the court proceedings, make sure he has contact with his attorney too. Yeah. Well, let's say now also then that there was an immigration hold, so dad doesn't, which meaning that he already had an order of deportation, so he doesn't really get a long drawn out process, and so he's deported. He's just deported a few weeks later. And maybe the ICE social workers had told us that was probably going to happen, so we kind of knew, dad's going to get deported, so maybe we're even talking to dad about that possibility. What would you do then? Dad is no longer here. Go ahead.
Contact the consulate and...
Yep. It doesn't even say what country, I realized, but that's okay.
Contact them and see if you can... Well, I guess we have to determine if the children were born here or if they immigrated here with mom and dad.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on that, then you can perhaps start to go forward with those fun acronyms that I don't remember.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, exactly. We'll find out. Let's say children, and it doesn't say here. Let's say children are U.S. citizens. The children are U.S. citizens already. We want to find that out. But yeah, obviously make sure that the counselor is aware. That is actually usually really helpful. Even if you've done a counselor notification before, at the beginning of a case, it's usually helpful to kind of update, contact the consulate, look, somebody we're involved with the case with has been deported. Maybe see if, there's any assistance that they can provide connecting the parent back to us. There are cases where if a parent is deported, you don't know where they are for a while. They're a lot of times just kind of dropped somewhere and they don't have a home anywhere and you're not always sure how to get in contact with them. Ideally, you would have made connection with that parent and been call me or text or WhatsApp me as soon as you're somewhere where you can, so that we can reestablish contact. But sometimes it takes a while, and sometimes the consulates have been helpful in helping us locate and find a parent again. Yeah. Let me see. This was actually a real case. Let me just tell you what actually happened. I can't remember if it was Georgia or South Carolina or something. And what actually happened is that the judge terminated this father's parental rights as he was fighting for custody of his children from Mexico, and was saying that he didn't attend court proceedings, etc. And it was appealed and overturned, and then dad was actually granted humanitarian parole to come back into the U.S. and fight it and get his children and bring them back to Mexico with him. But that was a real case. That's what happened. And so depending on where you're at, you will want to work with your consulate. Maybe DEEF is the Child Welfare Agency in Mexico. It's our kind of counterpart. Perhaps you can, work with them if it's in Mexico. you could potentially enlist the help of ISS, International Social Services, because now wherever dad lands in another country, if dad wants children back, and if dad wants children to come with him, we are going to have to study, right? Like, where is he living, his conditions. He's going to have to get the services to continue his reunification plan there. And so we're going to need help getting all that. But yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Oh, yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so let's just say that the children only came into our spectrum, or into us, with us, because the parent was deported, right? So they didn't have any previous with a child welfare, let's just say. And these children are now don't have a home. They don't have family here. Parents are in whatever country. Let's just say that the parents don't have a stable home or whatever it is, as or our own, welfare agencies think seems correct or perfect or whatever it is for these children to be brought to their family. What happens then? Because a lot of these people that are coming here are because they're already very impoverished, right? And so their living conditions might not even be up to par for them to have their children back. Would they be able to have them back?
Yeah, I mean, these are some really like important kind of cultural considerations, and to be working with I think so. The question is really around, okay, but what if children only came into care because dad was deported? So there wasn't abuse or neglect, but the children had nowhere to go. Depending on the state. But hopefully what would happen is that there really is no abuse or neglect, so you don't really have grounds to keep those kids into care. You don't have grounds to keep those kids in care. In our case, the best practice would be to reunify, like, as quickly as possible. And so, there wouldn't necessarily, we would probably do like a check, like a welfare check, but we wouldn't go through a whole like court-mandated services plan or home study. And again, it depends on the judge, and it depends on the state's position as well, in terms of like what we deem are appropriate standards of care. But I think that's where we can do a lot of education for ourselves and for and of our like court systems around what are appropriate standards of care in other countries, and if another country's social service system deems the situation to be safe enough for children, if you get a welfare check, or if social services in another country say it's okay, then we're not going to dispute that, even though the standards of living are different than our country, especially if dad wants the kids. Like, the dad has the right for the children to be with him, absent any other abuse or neglect. And as the child welfare agency, we don't have the right to determine whether or not the children get to be with him based on the standards of living in another country. And so we would be repatriating to dad as soon as possible, probably with help from the consulate. Yeah. There is a case, but then it gets really complicated. I would say, there's a case. We have had a case where there's a mom who has really severe untreated mental illness, who had like lost custody of her child in another country at one point, and the baby is somehow in the U.S. because she had needed some surgeries and had some really high severe medical needs, and that was mainly why she was here. The baby was here, but the mom has been deported, so she couldn't come here. But and mom really wants her child back, but the social service systems in the other country are even telling us, like, mom can't wrap her head around her daughter's like ongoing medical needs. like she wouldn't be able to keep the kid alive at this point. She doesn't have any sort of like stable living situation. She doesn't have the setup, and so it's really been an ongoing kind of difficult problem trying to like work with mom and the family in the other country to like really wrap in all the supports that she would need to basically keep her child alive. Yeah. So I mean, all this to say, like, every case is different too. You kind of have to look at like, well, what are the children's needs? Was the children, do the children have needs? You have to look at the children's needs. You have to look at the parents' capabilities. But fundamentally, if there's no abuse or neglect, I almost just see us as like the pass through to reunifying a child with their family member.
Even if they're experiencing homelessness.
Potentially. I mean, that's when I would probably really go through the child welfare. I mean, really try to set them up with supports and services. I mean, there's shelter, family, depending on where it's at. Like some families live in shelters long-term in other countries too. I don't know. I mean, it's a tough one. I think it's a tough one. And it depends on the parents' desires for the children. And depending on the age, depending on the children's age, if they have their own attorneys, it could depend on the children's desires too. It gets complicated. Yeah. Well, thanks. So I know we're almost out of time. I just wanted to point you, I don't know, our staff, set up these like screenshots of our website that has a lot of resources on there. That you can access. These are some very specific. We have a specific page that has child welfare and immigration resources on it from several different entities. These first two are geared towards practitioners, especially working directly with immigrant children and families, how to engage with families who are fearful, not asking directly about legal status when you're in the process of an assessment, a safety assessment or investigation. Like, that's not the priority. The priority is to make sure that kids are safe, and really it's through the process of time that it may come out that there might be some kind of legal immigration related issues. But also being really direct from the very beginning and just saying, like, we're not law enforcement. We're not here to, deal with immigration issues until you're able to especially build some sort of rapport, and then also able to tell families at a certain point and children the purpose of ever inquiring about immigration issues would be because we might actually be able to provide you some legal assistance, and we might be able to get you access to some benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So I think families have been, open in that sense. But there's lots of resources on that. Also, some very specific resources on working with trauma and trauma practice. And the last thing to point out is we have this practice network. It's this platform for ongoing communications among child welfare agency representatives across the country who work on immigration issues. So I can't remember, I think we have about, I'm not going to say, maybe 20 different states, representatives from different states and counties, hundreds of people who are part of this network and listserv that we have that bring us questions about working with immigrants. It's a peer network kind of learning thing. We have quarterly calls where we bring on immigrant legal representatives and immigrant advocates to talk about some of the latest policy issues and updates to things. And then people pose questions and we talk. And in between those calls, we have a listserv where you can get involved and bring any questions or issues that you might be having. And lots of times you might get multiple responses from multiple people in different states. Like, I've been really trying to contact my Guatemalan consulate and I haven't had success. Like, can anybody get me access to somebody from the Guatemalan consulate? And then like somebody we'll give them access to someone in a different state, and it's actually really helpful. And then we also have monthly newsletters if you want to sign up, which you can, and that's it. So that's all I have. If there are any other questions, or I know we're pretty much at time, and it's been a really long, well, I hope it hasn't felt that long, but it's, it hasn't felt that long to me, but 3 hours have just flown by, so I've really enjoyed this time with you. I've talked a lot. Anything else? Yeah.
I have a question in relation to the 6-second scenario, because I think it said the raid happened in a school. And if I remember from a previous slide, that's a safe. Is it a safe?
Sorry, no. Yeah, good question for that. The question was about the last, the second scenario where a raid. You said you believe that the raid happened at a school. It didn't say that. What the raid said, it was the dad was at work, and the raid happened at work, or he was just arrested at work, and the children were at school at the time. But you are right that schools are protected areas, and they cannot go to schools. Yeah. Anything else? And one other? Yeah.
You talked about a list or sheet built for resources families regarding the services that they are.
A public charge, the public charge fact sheet, yes.
Will that be included in your?
Sure, I will make sure the public charge fact sheet is on our site, and I will make sure to include it specifically in the list of resources I send you. That's helpful, yeah.
When you say schools are protected, is that just grade schools, or are universities?
Universities as well are protected. Yes, that doesn't stop people from standing right outside of the boundaries of the school waiting for people to leave, but yes, universities and schools are protected areas. Yeah. Anyone else? Good questions. Everybody is probably hungry and tired, and I just wanted to say I really, really appreciate you all. It's very humbling and honoring to be able to be here with you all, and that you all came and were so attentive and had so many good comments and questions. So, you know where to find us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it's really unique when a presentation can be both informative and practically useful and engaging all at once, and you really hit that note. So thank you very much. To everybody that's here, don't forget, if you didn't sign in, and especially if you need CEUs, and we will also email everyone any resources that Dr. Finno-Velasquez provides to us. But before we leave, I just wanted to give one moment of time to Erin Barbado, who is here and wanted to tell us about a local resource.
I'll hurry.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Barbado. I'm the director of the Immigrant Justice Clinic at the University of Wisconsin Law School. Professor Walsh asked if I would just share with you a minute about some work that we do. But we do have a pilot program for serving children who are eligible for special immigrant juvenile status. That being said, we only have capacity to take 10 to 20 cases a year. But we have been identified, Wisconsin, by Kids in Need of Defense as a state that is in need of more services for kids eligible for SIDGE. So hopefully in the near future, we're going to be getting more money to expand services throughout the community. And other thing I wanted to say is thank you so much for being here. The work that I do is always so much better when I work with someone like Yesenia in the community who's a social worker, and it's better service for our clients in the community when we can all collaborate. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a wonderful weekend.